Hello, you are listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your hosts, Thomas and Tammy Ferreira.
Hey guys, Tammy here, and you will notice this week I sound a little hoarse. I have come down with a cold due to the stress of everything, as you can imagine, and so I'm going to kind of be drinking some tea and some coffee throughout this to try to, or tea and water, excuse me, to try to keep myself listenable. I know that it's a little hard to listen to somebody when they have a really raspy voice like this. So if you listened to last week's episode, you'll know that unfortunately Thomas passed away about 2.5 weeks ago. I've had a lot of support from the community. I appreciate every person that's reached out, that's made a comment, that said something. My family and I really need your prayers. So I appreciate you, keeping us in prayer. I had a few comments of people who said, wow, you seem disconnected 1 minute and crying the next. And seems like that's how this episode's going to go too, because that's how we're starting out, right? So if you've ever grieved somebody close to you, you'll know that it kind of ebbs and flows and everybody processes differently. And so, when I'm doing the podcast or I'm doing something of that nature, I tend to disconnect. And that's kind of true when Thomas and I would record the podcast anyway. As you know, if you've ever recorded yourself or performed or done anything, you kind of have to get into the technical aspect of what you're doing and pay attention to things. And you're not always thinking about the emotions of things. So I'm going to try not to just cry through the whole episode. But if you haven't listened to last week's episode and you weren't aware, Thomas did pass away about 2.5 weeks ago. You can go back and listen to that episode to learn about what happened. I'm not going to repeat it again in future episodes. But what I want to talk about today, I've titled this episode A Love Story. And I want to talk a little bit about mine and Thomas's relationship, sort of the backside of it. I know that, you guys, a lot of you are avid listeners and watchers on YouTube. And so, you're kind of familiar with our dynamic and the way we do. And, that dynamic carries over in a lot of ways into our personal life, but we have tended not to talk about our story, right? Our relationship and the history of it a whole lot. And I'm sorry, I'm banging around my cup here. Just because, when you're going through a divorce and, it's hard to see other people together and happy, right? And I'm kind of experiencing that now as, being a widow and seeing all these other couples who are both still together and alive and, all those kinds of things. And it can be gut wrenching. It can be difficult. And divorce is definitely a grieving process, just like the loss of someone is. It's different in different ways. I think this loss is very different in some ways easier, in some ways harder. And so, I think next week I'm going to talk about that a little bit, of kind of the differences in the types of grief that we deal with as we're going through these kinds of situations. And, even when you have custody situations that come up and you're suddenly spending time away from your children, I think that in and of itself can also be a type of grieving, because it's grieving for the life you used to have, right? From the fact you used to get to be with your kids all the time and all that. And now you're sharing them with a co-parent and it looks different. And so sometimes we grieve our old life. So this week I want to talk about mine and Thomas's story. So Thomas and I met online and, for the first few weeks, we just emailed back and forth and kind of talked about our different interests. And we talked about music, which was a big part of our life together. I know you guys have talked about him surf. And so he was doing a lot of surfing. We met in the summer in July of 2006. And so he was doing a lot of surfing at that time. And I would email him and I wouldn't hear anything for 3 days. And I would think, this guy's not really interested. But what I soon learned was just if the surf was up, you had to wait. And that's kind of how it always was with him. So, but he also played guitar and was a very, very talented musician. He's one of those people that you could just play a song for him and say, hey, what key is this in? And he would know. And he would just tell you, oh, they're doing that in D. And then I would say, okay, well, that's not a good key for me to try to sing. Can we try it in G? And he would just flip over and could do that. Excuse me. I would say that that's probably, one of the hobbies that I am missing the most at this point, because that's the one that he and I did together. Of course, I didn't go surfing with him. I used to say surfing was the only time that we were actually apart. And again, I apologize for the breaks. I'm just trying to continue to keep my voice hydrated so that I don't get too squeaky on you here. So we met online, and then finally one weekend my computer crashed. Now, he always said that he thought this was a story I made up, but it wasn't. My computer crashed at home, and so I sent him a note before I left work on Friday, and I said, hey, just so you know, my computer, at home I'm having problems with, and so if you don't get a response to my email, feel free to call me. So he called me on that Saturday, and he asked me out for the following Wednesday, which was July 26th. So we met at a little restaurant in downtown Carlsbad, and then after dinner, we went down to the beach, and this will tell you one of the things about Thomas. So our very first date, when I always say I spent days getting ready for that, right? My girlfriend came over, we went through all the dresses I had, and we went shoe shopping, and I got my nails done, and all the things that girls do, right, to try to make ourselves as attractive as possible to the other person. And Thomas shows up, and he's in like shorts and kind of a pretty casual polo and tennis shoes. And we look back on that and we joke. And he said to me, my mother asked me, he told me this later, he didn't tell me at the time. He said, my mother asked me before I went out the door if that was what I was wearing on my date. So we were very differently dressed, needless to say. But obviously that wasn't a hindrance for either one of us. And so we went down to the beach, and we walked on the beach for 2 hours, just complaining about our exes and complaining about, just grieving the loss together, and grieving the loss of that other person that we loved. Thomas or I, neither one really wanted our divorces, and we were kind of forced into them. I had a husband that wouldn't stop having affairs, and Thomas had a wife that opted out. And so neither of us had really an option. And so it wasn't our choice. And so we really talked about that a lot, and the fact that we still had love for our spouses, and that didn't hinder us from feeling like the other person was somehow not able to, be with us or whatever, because we understood. I understood that he still had feelings for his ex-wife, but that didn't necessarily mean that, they were able to be together at that point or whatever. And she didn't want to be, so it wasn't possible. But I related to that, and I still had feelings for my ex-husband really at that point. So then our second date, we met at the beach and we walked again. And then we went back to his house, and I remember him trying to teach me how to dance. Him and his ex-wife had taken a lot of dance classes, and he was actually a very good dancer, which I know might seem a little bit weird because we've talked about Thomas has ADD, and in some ways he's not the most coordinated person. But he always said that his surfing was very not as fluid and smooth as some surfers and all that, even though he had been doing it for a really long time. And so we went back to his house, and he was trying to teach me to dance, and I was cracking up the whole time and stepping all over his feet. And, if dancing had been a high priority for him, I'm not sure we would have continued dating, because I was really kind of a disaster in a lot of ways. And then I was hungry. I hadn't eaten all day. He had stopped and gotten something to eat on the way to the beach to meet me, which I didn't do or plan for. And so I said to him, do you have anything? I'm a little bit hungry. Is there anything that we can have to eat? And so I'm a very, very picky eater, and Thomas does all the cooking now in our relationship. He has historically done all of the cooking. And the nice thing about it is he had learned all of my preferences, right? He knows what I like, what I don't like. I don't even have to say, don't put this on, do this, whatever. He just knew at this point we've been together 17 years. But that first night he went through all these different things, and I was like, no, sorry. And, you're kind of embarrassed, and you don't know this person that well. And he ended up going, how about a grilled cheese? And I was like, fine, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. And then he got started talking to me and he burnt it. So our running joke for the rest of our relationship, every time he made me a grilled cheese was, was he going to burn it? And he did on a few occasions, even after that. So that was kind of one of our things. And then, I always say from that point on, we just kind of clicked and personality wise, and we just kind of knew, like, we didn't really have to work at it in a certain way. We were very opposite and it just kind of flowed. And I always say, like, I think when you meet somebody, especially if you're older and you've been through other relationships, if your gut is telling you, no, there's something that's just kind of off or just not quite right, you should listen to that. Because I had that I went on a handful of other dates, right? First dates, like maybe 3 or something before Thomas. And they all were like that, where it was like, the person's okay. Like, they're nice. There's nothing wrong with them. It just doesn't, it's just not it. It just doesn't quite click in that way. And when I met Thomas, it was almost just like we were inseparable from that point on. And we each had 2 kids. We've talked about the boys were 1, 2, 11, and 15. And so we were kind of instant family, just add water. I always say there was not really a whole lot of dating per se in a lot of ways. It was a lot of having the kids. And at that point, he had his kids every weekend. So we were working during the week, and then on the weekends, we had the kids. And so we ended up moving in together just about 2 months. Yes, Labor Day weekend that year. So our first date was July 26th. We moved in together Labor Day weekend. I don't recommend that for everybody necessarily. I think it's good to take time to get to know people. But I think he and I just knew kind of instinctually in our gut that we were both looking for something permanent. Family was real important to both of us. We were both accepting of each other's children. And so that's what we did. So I will tell you, those first few years had some conflict. They were tough years. We had several really bad arguments where honestly, I didn't know if we were going to make it through it because it was so very tough. The co-parenting thing, having stepchildren is just, we've all heard the phrase that parenting is the most thankless job. Well, I always say, unless you've been a step parent, step parenting is the most thankless job because the kids don't have the same kind of affection for you that your own kids have. But yet you have to make very similar sacrifices and very similar support for those children without any of the return. So it can feel very thankless. And I think for me and Thomas both, the way we tried to channel that is by framing it in terms of, I do this out of love for Thomas, right? I mean, when I first met his kids, I obviously didn't have an attachment to them. I didn't love them in that way. But as my attachment to him grew, I did more and more things for his kids out of love for him. And then, of course, my love for his kids also grew, over that period. And of course, now they're 18 and 19, and they've continued to be in the house with me and all of those things since Thomas passed away. So their mother and I have continued the the same kind of rotation schedule that we always have. And they obviously have choice because they're 18 and 19, but they're continuing to do what they were doing before Thomas passed, so far at least. So, those first few years were tough. So I don't want to paint a picture like this was just all roses. It wasn't. It was a struggle. And then in 2008, Thomas started this law firm. And in 2009, I got laid off from my job and joined him. And again, tough years, 9, 10, 11, 2012. Those were all hard years because we were sort of finding our flow, right? We were almost in a power struggle, I would say, because, he's the attorney and he's, obviously had the legal knowledge and was trying to train me in that. At that point, I had none, but I had been an administrator for a long time and I was the person that kind of ran things. So we would kind of get into these power struggles where, he would be like, well, legally we need to do this. And I would be like, well, practically we need to do this, So we would have these little bouts of the power struggle. And then in 2013, I would say that's when our business really broke open, and we were so busy in 2013 that we worked almost every Saturday that year. We were just flooded with business, which was good, which we were grateful for. And then in 2014, as many of you know, my mother passed away, and that was a hit for us, right? Because I was very brain dead for, that was not a good choice of words, was it? But anyway, I had a very hard time. I had a lot of brain fog for about 3 or 4 months, really severely. And I really mourned the death of my mom pretty heavily for several years. I'm an only child, and that was a really, really tough hit for me. And Thomas, picked up the slack, and it was great to have somebody there that could do that and kind of keep things running when you were kind of down for the count, I suppose. And then I kind of recovered, and our business started to flow again. And we started saying, you know what? We don't really love the practice of law. Thomas didn't love it in that way. It was something he was good at in an intellectual way. But the battle of going into court and standing in front of the judges and fighting with each other, that just was not his style. I would always say he's a lover, not a fighter. And Thomas had really high emotional intelligence. I learned a lot about relationships from him, how to make them work, how to deal with difficult people, all those types of things. He would consume books, and he would be like, oh, you need to read this, or we'd have a discussion about it. And he just really grew my emotional IQ and my ability to help other people a lot during the time that I was with him. So in 2018, we decided to start this podcast. And so when we did that, it was kind of like, this is what we really want to do. We really want to teach people. We really want to help. We really want to be part of the problem. Because I think so many times when you're going through this type of thing, you don't get the explanation from attorneys on your situation from a practical perspective, right? You get what they think you should legally do according to how your case is handled under the law. But sometimes how your case is handled under the law isn't necessarily a good choice for you personally. There are intangible consequences to all of this, and there are what I call collateral damage. And so you can't make decisions solely on the legal aspect of what's happening. You have to consider the totality of your life. And so that can be really difficult when you're not getting the information that you need. I said my voice from being super raspy on you. Sorry. I don't have anybody here to be able to motion to get me something or do whatever like I normally would when I'm doing this. So if you don't have that information on what's happening on the practical side or how you should handle it, then you have this gap, and then you're trying to make decisions, and then you look back and go, oh, well, if I'd known A, B, C, or D, I wouldn't have handled that way. Or sometimes the attorney thinks that they have a likelihood of getting you an outcome, but how much is that going to cost you? And is it worth that to you? Because maybe financially, there are bigger considerations than getting, if I can get 5% more custody time, and that's going to get me, a little bit more time with my kids, but it's going to cost me $50,000 to do it. Is it worth it? And so you have to weigh those trade-offs, because there's not black and white answers to that. It's not like the lawyer can say, you should do this, you shouldn't do this, but they don't have to then go live your life and deal with the consequences of that choice. And so that's really where Thomas and I started to go, people need help. People don't understand what's happening. All they're getting is the legal version of this. And I'm not saying the legal version is not important. You have to understand that aspect too, because you have to understand how your decisions are going to impact what's happening legally in your case and what the potential consequences of that are. So I'm not saying that there's not a place for the legal aspect of it. There definitely is. But I'm saying there's a gap in there where in order to make good decisions, you need to be able to talk this through with somebody to have that practical advice and guidance from somebody that doesn't have a dog in the fight, right? That doesn't benefit from you going to court and battling. I talked to somebody yesterday who's just spent thousands and thousands and, wants to hire me as a coach to help her. And I said, one of the things my husband used to say is an attorney will fight with every last drop of your money. And I find that to be true. And I think there are times that you have a spouse to where you have to do that. You don't have any choice. They don't leave you a lot of choice. But there are also situations where, and I would say these are the vast majority of times, where things could have been handled much better, much more efficiently, and in a much less stressful, less financially devastating way if you had only had the information that you needed from the very beginning, right? And so that's really where the podcast came in for us. And once Thomas and I started doing the podcast, we kind of hit a stride where our relationship flowed, right? Like my kids had grown up and left home. Okay. There was a lot of conflict, I think, when my kids were in the house because we just had the two sets of kids and, different decisions, and there was conflict there. But we kind of made it through that. My kids left. We had his kids here. But he and I sort of hit our point where we kind of were, our relationship flowed. It wasn't hard. It wasn't stressful. He was like my best friend. I told him every day, "You're my best friend, honey." And he would say, "You're my best friend too, Tammy." And so that's the point we had gotten to. And I think that came through on the podcast as well, because when we first started out, we would do outlines, right? To keep us on the same page, because we were kind of that fighting each other for control, right? And then we got to the point where we just had a few bullet points just to kind of keep us on track. And then I would say the last year and a half here, we don't even use a script. We just come up with a topic. We don't even really discuss it in a lot of detail because we want to come on and have it be fresh, right? And so we had just gotten to the point in all different aspects that things flowed really well. And one of the reasons I want you to know this is because I want you to feel like there's hope. There's hope for you to have happiness after divorce. It's not a death sentence. It's not the end of it. As long as God has you here, there's a purpose for you. And I believe that God has a purpose for me still being here, even though it's very, very difficult for me without Thomas, obviously. This has impacted every aspect of my life. There's no corner that isn't touched by the loss of him. So it's been extremely difficult, but I know that there's a reason and there's a plan. And so we're going to push forward, and we're going to push forward together. Okay. So, like I said, the one thing I want you to take from this episode is hope. There is hope. And even if it's not a relationship, I always say this, it doesn't have to be a relationship. I don't know that I'll get into another relationship. It's only been about 2.5 weeks since Thomas's accident. I have no idea how I feel yet. And I don't even know if that'll be a possibility for me or not. But whether it's your career, whether it's how you serve others, whether it's how you raise your children, how you take care of your parents, or a relationship, whatever that is for you, there's some purpose in what you're doing, and you can find joy and happiness in that. I went back and listened to an old episode before Thomas's memorial last Saturday, and it was our episode 56 on what do you want on your tombstone, which is a little bit surreal to listen to at this point. But one of the things that Thomas said in there is he said, "I want people to say that they always saw me and I had so much joy," because that's the type of person that you want to be around, someone that can find joy even in difficult times. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to live that. I'm trying to be that. I'm trying to be an example of that to our children and to the community. So next week, I am going to explore grief a little bit. I'm going to talk about the grieving process as it applies to, my situation, as it applies to divorce, because I've been through that grief as well, how it compares, the grief of the shift in your in your parenting and the time you have with your kids. Maybe you've lost a parent. Maybe you've lost someone close to you. And we're just going to kind of explore that in general in various aspects. And then probably after next week, I will get back to some nuts and bolts and we'll kind of dig in on, some of the divorce and child custody stuff. I haven't come up with topics yet, but obviously that'll be my job moving forward. Okay. Thank you guys again for all the support. Thank you for joining me this week. I'm sorry my voice is a little raspy. Hopefully the cold's gone by next week, and I will see you guys then. If you're listening to us on YouTube, don't forget to like this video and rate and review us so that you get or subscribe to the channel so you get notified as new episodes come out. If you are listening to the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and also rate and review us. That helps other people find us and find the episodes that they need. Okay? Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your hosts, Thomas and Tammy Ferreira. For more information, visit www.divorceuniversityonline.com.